I worked the Trans-Alaskan pipeline in the 70s. This is my story, by bigolbrew. In July of 1974, I was in particularly dire financial straits. I would argue that everything about my life situation was dire. Failed relationship, check. Falling out with parents, check. Essentially broke and directionless at 21 years of age, check and check. At the time, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle, but always had dreams of exploring the world, venturing far away, writing something akin to the next great American novel. So it's no surprise when I saw flyers advertising 3 months of work in America's unexplored frontier. I jumped on the opportunity. Of course, working for the oil industry was something that should have repulsed my younger self to the core, but my hypocrisy had also provided me with a loose justification. In my head, I wasn't technically complicit with the extraction of oil and the destruction of the natural environments of Alaska because I was hired as a surveyor of sorts, with no prior experience in oil and only a basic degree in engineering. An affiliate of BP hired me to work alongside young men in similar situations as me. That is, we were all penniless, below the age of 25, somewhat able-bodied, and willing to spend our late summer and autumn in the frigid wastelands of northern Alaska, determined to locate the best and most strategic positions for the construction of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, the construction of which had begun earlier that year. In early August, I arrived in Anchorage, then in Fairbanks, where I was to meet Mr. Joseph J. Packowitz, the field director of our little operation. Fairbanks had the atmosphere of both a boomtown, with the constant construction, a ubiquitous and unrelenting sound of machinery, and also the atmosphere of an eerie ghost town where the sun almost never set. Any inhabitants walking down the street seemed impervious to their surroundings, akin to zombies. Creepy as it was at the time, it was nothing compared to what would happen in the ensuing months. After meeting with the dozen colleagues that I was to work with, Packowitz drove us 250 miles due north in what was called a Land Rover Series IIB, essentially an all-terrain vehicle designed for transporting many people. Packowitz was no older than 40, but already sported a receding hairline of sorts, a slender body that was simultaneously equipped with a beer gut and these massive, dark-horned rimmed glasses that were too dorky even for the 70s. Behind us on our journey were 2 semi-trucks, each equipped with one modest-sized portable mobile home and God knows how many gallons of gasoline for the Land Rover. Our end destination was a sort of desolate, barren, permafrost-ridden valley just south of the so-called Gates to the Arctic, a completely isolated and frozen mountain range. The landscape was something I had never seen before. The sheer barrenness and openness of the whole thing was terrifying. The lack of night was equally terrifying. It was midnight and the sun was just beginning to set behind the Gates to the Arctic. The ride to our destination was largely silent, with Packowitz occasionally opining the phrases such as, "Champs, this here is where the expeditioners in the gold rush croaked," or, "Champs, this is where folklore tells us something or other went down." Charming. I never understood why he called us champs, either. Eventually, we set up our mobile home base camp and spent our first night in the Arctic Circle. The Arctic sun was coming through our windows intermittently. Even that first night, there were rattles and clanks and some faint yet shrill cries heard outside. But of course, my slightly dim-witted colleagues attributed it to the oh-so-eccentric Packowitz messing with us. The next few days were largely mundane, surveying and having the Land Rover drive us to and from base camp. I could go into detail about the work we did, but you'd all fall sound asleep. On the 4th night, I was as restless as ever, the day and night cycle messing with my sleeping schedule even worse than when I had arrived, and the faint noises coming from outside keeping me equally uneasy. Uneasy was the only word going through my head those first few days. The small mobile home we bunked in felt uneasy. The mood when we worked in the crisp, chilly weather out in the barren mountainous wastelands of northern Alaska was uneasy. Silence made me uneasy, but so did anything so much as resembling a noise. I couldn't handle or comprehend it. I grabbed a beer from one of the coolers and decided to venture outside with Mr. Petrovich, a large-framed and dull man who had worked as a fisherman in years prior. He was friendly enough and shared my feelings of immense hesitation about where we were. He snagged himself a brew as well, and we figured it was just warm enough to hang outside below the steep mountain incline surrounding us. "Have you been hearing the same things outside I have?" he asked me, taking a look at the sun finally setting over the adjacent rocky cliffs. "Yeah, they're so dark, you know?" I said hesitantly. It's like the sound of a wounded animal or something." "You reckon it's Packowitz?" he asked, taking a sip of his beer. No, he's a weirdo, but he wouldn't know a prank if it stared him in his horn-rimmed pudgy face." "He's a champ," Mark said, chuckling. "Don't get me started," I said, laughing. But before our banter could really get rolling, we heard the sharp yet acute sounds coming from each and every direction. They were akin to a cry or a groan, but not in an animalistic way. It was truly something else. "Let's check it out," I said bluntly. "Seriously?" "Yeah, why not? I mean, if it's a bear or something, we're both packing heat, so yeah." True, Mark quipped, a little nervously. We sat down our beers and loaded up our handguns as a proper precaution and started venturing away from the safety of the dimly lit base camp. Neither Mark nor I wanted to appear weak, so we kept slowly meandering towards where we felt the source of the noises were. The noises themselves were sporadic, occurring in short bursts, but the direction of the cries was impossible to decipher. They really were coming from every direction. As the sun finally set, I heard a brief, yet calm, almost familiar voice say, "Please help me." "Did you hear that?" I said, turning to Mark. "No, are you good, man?" "Yeah, I think." But as soon as I thought I was losing it, Mark had a similar scared reaction. "Did you say that?" he angrily quipped. "Say what?" "You know what." Before either of us could finish our hurried thoughts, we were both met with an ear-piercing, soul-shattering scream that caused us to both fall to the ground. We held our ears, begging for the ground-shaking yell to end. After the event, we both swore that we saw immensely bright and flashing lights. As we heard and witnessed this, we saw a familiar face walking towards us in the night. "Packowitz," I said, tearing up. Packowitz walked towards us, his handgun pointed at Mark and I, who were still lying on the frozen ground. "You shouldn't come out here," he opined calmly. "It does crazy things to ordinary people, champs. Let me take y'all inside. It's better for your health, you understand?" We both shook our heads yes, in equal parts, disbelief and terror. The next day was a blur. Neither Mark nor I remembered the journey back to our little camp, and we hardly remembered the next day's surveying. That night, however, we agreed to silently sneak out again, both of us packing equal parts heat and perceived ballsiness. We felt ready, prepared for whatever we swore existed in this hellish landscape. A light snow fell as we walked. It was no earlier than 11:30 p.m., but the relentless Arctic sun was already sitting idly in the sky, taking its sweet time to duck behind the mountains. We must have walked for miles, and we walked with purpose, trying to ignore the sharp sounds surrounding us. "Do you still think Packowitz was messing with us?" I asked Mark, as we began to climb into the mountains. "Messing with us? I think he knows something we don't." "No kidding," I said. "Don't treat me like that," Mark said, frustrated. "Like what?" I said. "Like I'm some retard or something." "I'm not, man. I'm not. Whatever." We carefully trekked up the first steep mountain. The climb couldn't have been more than 750 feet in elevation, but the sheer verticalness, combined with the setting sun and an icy Arctic ground, was brutal. And that didn't even compare to the eerie silence. The sounds that had seemingly surrounded us in every which way had died down abruptly once we reached the top of the mountain. The light snow had picked up into a zero visibility, blistering cold snowfall. Mark drew a flask from his coat as we looked at the frozen valley below us. "It's quiet as can be," he said, staring at the tundra below. "I mean, now it isn't." "What's that?" Mark said. "Nothing," I said as I reached for his flask. But the silence, yet again, came to a grinding halt when I heard what sounded like Mark saying, "You're not gonna make it. Nobody here does." "What did you just say to me?" I said, spinning around angrily. "I didn't say anything," he said, his teeth chattering in fear. I attempted to calm my nerves with a deep breath and a pull from Mark's mystery flask. That is, until Mark delivered a swift slap to my face. "Don't you dare say that to me!" he yelled as he delivered his slap, but I didn't respond with further anger, more of a fearful curiosity. "What do you think I said?" I asked. Well, you said I'm going to die tonight," he said, his anger dissipating. Just as Mark and I were ready to check ourselves into the nearest psychiatric ward, we simultaneously turned to our left and saw two silhouettes sitting in the snowy moonlight. It was us, nearly identical carbon-like copies of Mark and I sitting in the snow, staring right at us. They looked identical, but possessed these black pupils and ominous grins. They stood up and walked right towards Mark and I. Mark and I, paralyzed in fear, too scared to move an inch, effectively let their black pupils stare us dead in our eyes. And as they did, they simultaneously let out the shrill, sharp, ear-piercing, earth-shattering howls we had heard for the last several days. And that's the last thing I remember. As everything faded to black, I swear I heard a voice faintly mutter, "Champs," in the middle of the howls. "Congratulations on finishing the job, champs," Packowitz said to the whole crew, holding a large pint high. We were in what appeared to be some sort of sports bar, with Packowitz leading a cheer, a toast for Mark, me, and all of our colleagues. Mark and I both turned to each other, our expressions quickly turning into a petrified state. Packowitz finished his toast, and I looked at the atmosphere around me. It was a dimly lit sports bar, presumably back in Fairbanks. One of those nudie calendars was perfectly behind the bar, the month reading November 1974. Mark and I, without saying a word to one another, walked up to Packowitz and demanded an explanation in equal parts incomprehensible and hysterical terms. "Champs, champs," he said to us, smiling wide. "Why do you boys seem so nervous? You did a phenomenal job out there. Did I forget your paycheck or something? You know, if I did, I can guarantee you it's in my car. It's not about the paycheck, sir. It's just..." "Listen to me spouting off," Packowitz said, grinning. "Listen, champs, I know it was a rough few months in the tundra, but it's nothing to cry or howl over. I mean, fellas, you two seem like ghosts of your former selves. Y'all see something out there you should be telling me about?" Mark and I slowly backed away from Packowitz. Holding back my nausea, I ran to the bathroom, concealing the hysterical tears that I knew were coming. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. My hair was disheveled, my clothes were tattered and dirty, and my pupils were pitch black. Despite all of this, I've been living in Alaska ever since. I ended up as a fisherman out by Sitka with Mark, and have worked some odd jobs ever since. We rarely talk about what happened, if ever anymore, mostly on the basis that we hardly know what happened. Our pitch-black pupils and ghost-like appearance serves as a constant reminder of it, though. We're largely outcast. Maybe it's the constant series of dead-end jobs, failed relationships, and trauma from the event. Maybe it's our eyes that are too terrifying for normal people. Whatever it is, when you come to Alaska, come for the scenery, the endless activities, and even some of the unique towns. But I'd recommend passing on the mountain valleys just below the gates to the Arctic.